Hi, Guy. Tonight we will dive into a world where your breath will turn into white mist. Even before you open the curved wooden door of the thatched cottage, the night air bites your skin as if it had teeth, and the ground outside creaks beneath your bare feet. Imagine that before you even take a bite of the bread crust, that chai has already crept up to your bones. You might not be able to survive. If you were suddenly thrown into a medieval village in the bitter cold of winter, it wouldn't happen. But tonight, I will help you imagine how humans have survived. So before you feel comfortable, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video, but only if you really enjoy what I'm doing here. Please tell me in the comments what you are listening to and what time it is now. Now, dim the lights and let's slip into the frozen dawn of centuries ago. When you open your eyes, it's still dark. In medieval Europe, winter mornings came very late, and the cold forced you to drill holes in rough straw in as stuffed blankets. The roof above your head groans from the frost, and the cold air seeps in through the roofing the cracks in it. You have been sleeping beside your family, with your limbs wrapped around, partly for comfort and mainly for warmth. Your breath mingled with theirs in the polluted air, for fire in the central fireplace went out overnight, leaving only faint embers, whispering the heat of yesterday. Pulling oneself out of bed is like stripping oneself from life. The stone floor beneath your caluses is hard and cold. You reached out to take the very hard wool coat from yesterday, because the clothes hanging on the hanger by the wall would freeze overnight. Outside, the sun had not yet risen, and dim grey light faintly shone in through the small windowless windows coated with oilcloth or wooden shutters. The first task is to bring life back into the flames. Without it, you would be completely unprepared. Bend down, blow out the embers, and feed them with small twigs, dry awesome and gnaw blocks, if there is no wood. Sometimes when you fail, you have to reignite the fire with the spark of flint. The entire family can tremble until noon, waiting for the return of warmth. There's no breakfast waiting on the stove. The best minus case scenario is that yesterday's bread was as hard as stone, because medieval bread had more grit than flour, thanks to the small fragments left in the bread by the stone mill. When you bite it, your tooth hurts, but the feeling of hunger lingers on. Sometimes, if your luck permits, you can dip it in light beer or light milk heated over a fire. It's not luxurious, but it can prevent your stomach from folding up by itself. Outside, the village was silent. The snow covered everything, enveloping the scenery in silence. However, beneath this silence lies a cruel truth. Survival is the only priority. People, wrapped in wool and patched cloaks, walked carefully towards the barn to check if their animals had survived the night. Chickens were huddled together, cattle were steaming in the cowshed, and the smell of sheep rose like small clouds. Animals are life itself. Without their milk, meat and feces, it is impossible to survive in this season. This is the mainstream historical fact. In many regions of medieval northern Europe, farmers spent merely half of the year in some fall of winter, which meant that preparing for cold weather was not a luxury, but an annual necessity. Then came a strange behind the scenes story. Some villagers even apply goose soil on their faces before going out, believing that this can protect them from the bone-chilling frost. You might be laughing now, but without Vaseline or a warm scarf, you would also get yourself dirty. During the day, I struggled to move forward, and the grey sky rarely brightened. The fields were covered with ice and were of no use. Work in shifts indoors, spinning, weaving, mending, and sharpening knives. The smell of damp wool and smoky flames enveloped everything. When the weather permits, men go to the woods to gather firewood, although disputes often occur. Is it legal to collect fallen branches in God's forest? Historians are still debating whether peasant families have more freedom to modify the rules in winter, as it is more difficult to enforce them when snow blocks the roads. You find yourself walking more slowly than usual. The cold makes every task burdensome. Every breath hurts. The soundscape is very strange. The snow stream beneath our feet. Occasional barking of a dog. The moaning sound of wood resisting frost. The night is longer than the day and darker than imagined. You curled up by the fireplace, gazing at the flickering flames and telling yourself that spring would eventually come. Dawn after dawn repeats the same lesson. You wake up to the darkness, to the frost, and to survival. The world is very small. Your cottage, the barn, and the path between them. However, at that cold dawn, every villager shared the same thought as you. As long as we get through today, that's fine. Tomorrow will come. There is still one chance to breathe in the cold. You walked out of the hut with heavy steps, your shoulders hunched into a ball. The air woke you up, louder than the cawing of any crow. The wisps of smoke rising from the crooked chimney still enveloped the entire village. Yet you notice that the bone-minus chilling wind is blowing in through every crack in the house. This is where the problem lies. These houses weren't ever built to withstand the winters of the Middle Ages. The small house you live in is not the kind of tidy stone house in fairy tales. This is a single minus-room wooden house with main walls and main walls. This means that thin twigs are woven into a basket, coated with a sticky mixture of clay, straw and animal manure. If you press your palm against the wall in winter, it is almost alive because the cold seeps in. The roof was covered with thatch, and it was densely stuffed with snow, but the snow still formed clumps. When the ice melted, water also dripped into the bucket. You squatted by the stove again, coaxing the flame to burn upwards. The smoke rolled up and stung your eyes because there was no chimney in the room, only a smoke vent on the roof. Your clothes are soaked with that pungent smell every day. You cough, but you need a fire more than clean air. Families often argue whether to open the blinds to let the smoke out or close them to let the heat in. Anyway, your lungs have never had a rest. There is no glass on your window. Only a few pieces of oiled cloth stretch out, allowing the faint light to come in. On windy days, the fabric rustles, and where you hear the whispers of the cold creeping in. You pulled your cloak tighter, but the wind still climbed up your legs. A mainstream historical fact. Medieval houses, especially those of farmers, had almost no insulation materials. Archaeological evidence shows that the walls are as thin as 6 inches and can only offer more protection than tents in heavy snow. In such a space, fire is not merely about warmth. This is the only way to prevent freezing to death. This is your anecdote. Some villagers even live together with chickens, goats and even pigs at home. It's not because they have feelings for animals, but because the extra body gives off extra heat. Imagine a snoring sow dozing off on your leg. The layout is very simple. The bed is on one wall, the storage room is on the other, and the fire pit is in the middle. You might want privacy, but forget it. Children, parents and sometimes servants all crowded into a room filled with smoke. Even at night, someone's coughing or snoring can pierce through the crackling of the fire. The granary in the corner was half empty, and mice were grabbing breadcrumbs. The smell of mold blends with the lingering scent of the barn, reminding you of how closely your survival is linked to the animals you have taken in. Stepping outside again, you feel the wind sliding down your collar, reminding you why the beds at home are always more crowded in January. For houses in your village form a rough cluster, leaning against each other like weary travelers. Sometimes the wood nodes during winter storms, and when neighbors wake up, they find the entire wall sagging inward. The repair has to wait until the warm months, so you can only make do with wooden pillars and straw stuffed in the cracks. You might wonder if it has always been so well minus ventilated. Some scholars believe that wealthier farmers might paint their walls smoother or hang woven tapestries to keep warm. Others believe that even wealthy villagers lived on blackened rafters and damp, cold floors because chimneys were not widespread until the late Middle Ages. The truth might lie somewhere in between. Historians are still debating how much difference there is between poor farmhouses and slightly better houses of wealthy farmers. You sat on the wooden stool for a while, feeling its weighing on the uneven floor and watching your breath cool in front of you. Every inch of the house reminds you that living in winter is not comfortable but requires endurance. When the wind howls through the crack, making the blinds rustle, you won't think of the beauty and pride of your home. You just want to know if the roof can last until dawn. There is a smell of smoke on your hair. Your clothes are itchy from wet wool. Every time you bend down to add fire to the fire, you pray that the sparks won't hit the top of the thatched cottage. Your house may be poorly ventilated, shrouded in smoke and crowded, but in the cold months, it remains a thin line between you and the icy darkness outside. When you go outside, you will feel the coldness in your lungs, and it's not just the air, it's just like swallowing a knife. The little house behind you was belching smoke, but no matter how tightly you squeezed by the stove, the fire wouldn't last long. This is why every winter morning, this question hangs over your head like a grey cloud. Where can you find enough fuel to keep that fragile flame burning? What is the obvious answer, but it is also the most difficult to obtain? God owns the forest, and the punishment for poaching timber may be cruel. Sometimes you can collect fallen branches, but cutting down trees without permission is dangerous. So you sneaky along the edge of the forest, looking for debris, twigs, bushes, anything dry enough to burn. Her family, dragging things tied to their backs, trailed their steps on the frozen railway tracks, their heavy shoulders groaning. If you're lucky, you can get in touch with peat. The thick turf was cut down and dried in summer, and now it is piled up in the corner like a treasure. When they were thrown into the fire, they slowly smouldered, filling the hut with thick earthy smoke. Your eyes were moist, your chest was tense, but the heat lingered for a long time. You tell yourself it's worth it. Then there is feces. Yes, you scrape dry the cow dung and sheep dung, make them into flat pies, and then let them harden in the weeks unlit. After that, when they burn, they give off a pungent smell and will stick to your clothes, bed and hair. People wrinkled their noses, but no one complained because without fecal fuel, winter nights would be darker and colder, and you couldn't bear it. A mainstream historical fact. In most parts of medieval Europe, the shortage of wood was already very serious in the 13th century, especially in areas where forests were cut down for agriculture. Farmers are increasingly relying on peat and manure as substitutes for firewood, especially during the long winter. There is also a strange gossip. Some families would throw a small pile of bones into the fire, not for warmth, but for superstition. Crackling bones are believed to drive away evil spirits lurking in the cold night sky. Do you still remember that collecting fuel is not just about heating? This is also related to cooking. Without it, you can't cook porridge or bake bread. This is why villagers often get together to gather firewood. In some areas, they build public ovens to save fuel, bake bread in batches and share the heat. Imagine that while waiting by the oven, people are chatting idly, with their cheeks flushed red by the snow. However, all of this is not easy. Some days you trudge for miles to gather wood, struggling through snowdrifts that climb over your boots. Your fingers are stiff until you don't know if you are still holding the package or if it has frozen onto your skin. It's even worse at night. When you wake up, embers are faintly glowing, and your chest is filled with panic. If the fire is completely extinguished, it may take several hours to reignite it. During those times, frost crept into every corner and you trembled uncontrollably. This is why every household would assign someone to stir the embers at night and feed them with small twigs, so that the fireplace would not turn black. But how much fuel is enough? Scholars are still confused about the actual consumption rate. Some people believe that farmers spend half of their waking hours merely collecting and managing fuel, while others think that families are astonishingly efficient, extending every penny with skills passed down from generation to generation. You dragged another package through the snow. Despite the cold, sweat still stuck to your back. Every stream on the sled was like a heartbeat. Behind you, the little house awaits you, and the smoke from the chimney drifts towards the pale winter sky. Letting the smoke keep rising is not just for comfort. This indicates that you are still alive and persisting through this season, while nature seems determined to freeze you in place. When you reached the door again, your arms hurt, your nose was burning hot from the wind, and your lungs were pricked by the cold air. You threw the wood into the corner with a sense of relief, knowing that there would still be at least one more fire tonight. Do it again tomorrow, because in the winter of the Middle Ages, survival meant being a scavenger, chasing heat as if it were the rarest treasure on earth. You came back from the woods with a painful arm, but you had to face another overlooked problem. Food fire can keep you alive through the night, but if nothing goes into your stomach, warmth alone is not enough. In the winter of a medieval village, the pantry shrank, the cabinets echoed, and every meal turned into a small gamble. You glanced at the storage corner of the hut, where the wooden barrels crouched in the shadows like sentries. One type is salted meat. Its surface is white, while the meat beneath is turned grey and has a silky texture due to long minus term storage. Another one is filled with grains, but if you look too closely, You will find silk crawling among the grains. Here is a small jar of beans. On the shelf above the fireplace hangs an onion string, which is withered into a shell. This is not much, and it must continue until the earth softens again. Bread is the staple food. He baked coarse bread with rye or barley flour, usually mixed with any fillers you can find. Peas, ground acorns, or chestnut flour, if the harvest is good. The result is heavy, sour and sometimes moldy. You scrape off the spot and eat it, for hunger offers you almost no choice. Salted meat has become the core of winter food. In autumn, pigs are slaughtered. Salt is smeared on the meat and they are put into buckets. The taste after several months is sharp, salty and chewy, usually boiled to soften it. If you're lucky, you can stretch it with Chinese cabbage or radish. If not, one can only eat meat. And mainstream historical fact. Most medieval villages relied heavily on preserving food in autumn to get through the months when fresh crops were impossible. Sun-drying, smoking and drying are the main methods to keep meat and fish edible before spring. But here is a strange gossip. In some places people soak stale bread in warm beer, which is called so. It is soft and filling. Surprisingly, it proves that even leftovers can be turned into delicious food if you use your imagination. Of course, the shortage is spreading faster than you expected. The mouse bit a hole in the sack and found the store. Mold spreads in the damp bucket. Some families start scraping the bottom of the scratch box earlier than others. People began to whisper to each other about who had enough spare money. That tense atmosphere has never truly left the air. You sat by the stove, breaking the bread crust in half and watching the crumbs fall into the ashes. Children cry more in winter and their stomachs growl all night long. The parents asked them to be quiet, promising that spring was not far away. You want to know if your store can survive. Historians are still debating how common complete hunger was in an ordinary winter. Some people believe that most villages are well miners prepared to avoid fatal hunger, while others point out that there are recorded years of famine. When frost or flood destroys the harvest and the entire community withers, the truth may waver with wealth, weather and stored food. The small room was filled with the smell of boiling radish soup, thin and moist but steaming hot. You took a sip. Although the taste was still far from satisfactory, its warmth made you feel comfortable. Each spoonful has a faint smell of smoke, salt and a hint of bitter taste of survival. The outside world is still frozen, but you are inside, guarding your bucket, your sack, your precious withered onion. Every meal should be measured accurately. Every bite counts. You don't eat to feel full. You have to endure for one more day, until the snow melts and the fields come back to life. You sat by the stove, gazing at the faint flame, your stomach growling in the wind rustling your blinds. And every time you check the granary, you feel that it has become smaller. The salted meat became harder and saltier week by week, and the cabbage hanging on the rafters also became soft and sour. At this moment, what you are thinking about is not the banquet. You are considering turning the leftovers into something like a meal. So you began your preparations for winter. GRL, this doesn't sound glamorous, and indeed it is. Take a handful of barley or oats, stir it into water and let it soak into a pale paste. If you're lucky, you can also add a little milk. When the weather is fine, you will put a small piece of lard in the pot, let it melt, and then sprinkle a light layer of grease on the pot. However, on most days, it's just water and grains, plain and unremarkable, but enough to keep one from feeling hungry for the time being. The chroniclers of that era mentioned how farmers relied on grains during the months of poor harvest. Sometimes it's eaten for breakfast and dinner. The trick does not lie in taste, but in survival among a large amount of food. You fill your stomach with steaming hot porridge, even though your body still craves meat. Here is a strange little detail. GRL is more than just food. Sometimes villagers use it to treat diseases and feed it to the sick because it is soft and easy to swallow. Babies, the elderly and anyone whose fever is coming down often stay on this pile of garbage for several weeks. Imagine this is called comfort food. When you stir the pot, the smell of wet grains wafts through the smoky air. The children gathered around, their eyes wide open, holding bowls in their hands, waiting to get a share of the soup. They know that the top layer is the warmest, but they will argue about who gets the first spoon. You scoop out spoonful after spoonful of food, watching the steam rise gently up the rafters, hoping it will make everyone feel full. How many times have people eaten meat with such a girl? Historians have yet to reach a definite conclusion on this. Some evidence suggests that, apart from festivals, farmers rarely come into contact with meat, while other records indicate that moderate amounts of bacon or salted fish were stuffed in more frequently than previously thought. The truth might lie in the inequality of life in the Middle Ages. One village was full of pickled herring, while in another, the mold in the granary was being scraped off. You took a bite yourself. The texture was solid and the smell of the wooden pot was slightly sour. It sticks to your ribs but doesn't irritate your senses. However, its heat has a soothing feeling, and when the storm howls outside, there is a rhythm when scooping the paste into your mouth. In the evening, every household falls asleep wrapped in porridge, dreaming of the feast that will never come. In the morning, they cooked another pot of porridge, for in winter, thin porridge is still better than nothing. Last night's can of girl solidified grey, reminding people that winter food is more for endurance than for happiness. However, when dawn climbs up the frosted thatched roof, you reach out in search of another lifeline liquid, warm and intoxicating, enough to dull the edge of hunger, a fermented drink. You might imagine a medieval village holding steaming hot cocoa or hot tea, but these luxury goods did not reach Europe until a long time later. On the contrary, the beverages that help people get through the cold season are ale, cider, and in some areas, a bland and almost ridiculous beer. These are not party drinks. They are survival tools. When water sources freeze or deteriorate, fermentation becomes the safest way to replenish water. So when you hold the earthenware cup to your mouth, it's not indulgence but necessity. This process begins several months in advance of late summer or autumn. Barley or rye is peeled, crushed, boiled, and then fermented in wooden barrels. Apples are pressed into cider, while honey diluted with water becomes meat. If you are lucky enough to keep bees, by noon your wine barrels will be lined up neatly like guards defending against thirst. Dip it with a spoon, pour it into a cup and then drink. Its taste is sour, earthy, and sometimes bitter, but your body welcomes the warmth spreading throughout your chest. Records from that time showed that people drank there every day, even children. It's not because of the parents' recklessness, but because the alcohol content is so low that it can hardly be considered intoxicating. It can be imagined as liquid bread, a weak, famicalorie supplement that enables villagers to trudge through endless snowy days. An interesting side note: sometimes brewing can go wrong. Without modern control, fermentation might make your malted liquor sour, or make your cider taste like a mixture of vinegar and smoke. The villagers still drank with a wry smile, because wasted drinks meant wasted calories. Some people even use marsh myrtle, heather or rosemary to flavor the bitterness. Medieval craft beers, although they might not be very worthy of being on Instagram. You and your family are sitting in the small house, passing around a jar. Everyone took a sip, their lips touching the edge of the pottery. This liquid relieved the intense pain in their stomachs. The children giggled as the bubbles tickled their noses, while the elders half-minus closed their eyes and nodded slowly, allowing the warmth to seep in. The fireplace made a faint crackling sound. For a moment, almost everyone felt content. But how important is beer to farmers' lives? Researchers still have differences. Some people think that the amount of alcohol consumed at that time was astonishing, with each person drinking several liters a day, while others believe that this figure was exaggerated, indicating that people were equally heavily dependent on thin porridge and broth. There are no definite records. We can only guess through the mist of the wine barrels. At least we know that the villagers drank malt liquor, not for drinking but for survival. Go out and you'll see another sign of fermentation. Buckets piled up against the wall. The bucket is covered with frost. The spill stuck to the ground and there was a faint sweet smell in the air. In regions where cider is produced, the aroma of apples adheres to the barns. Every bite is filled with the memories of autumn. The rice is rare and golden, and it is more than just a drink. It is almost a treasure that is only brought out when one's mood is dangerously low. For when a neighbor is ill and needs medicine, there is a strange twist here. People believe that beer is not only for hydration, but also for mental safety. Some people believe that the bubble itself has a protective power and can drive away the evil spirits lurking in the long night. Drinking alcohol is not only for strengthening your body, but also for strengthening your soul. Imagine your fingers numb and your shoulders aching, trudging back from the woods, and then holding a steaming cup of spiced beer in your hands. Yet sometimes they heat it with herbs and then place it beside the fire. The aroma wafted towards you, sweet. You took a sip. It can't eliminate hunger, but it alleviates the fear of another endless night. Of course, beer can also be a prank. He accidentally brewed strong liquor, made the villagers stumble. Their tongues loosened, their laughter louder than usual. There is a story that on a winter night, songs came from the smoke miners filled little house, and they were drinking too much. The next morning, everyone had a headache. This luxurious feeling proved that people were not so hungry as to completely ignore joy. The children in your hut are drinking light beer with bread, their eyes wide open, not realizing that one day they will carry buckets by themselves. Your neighbor knocked on the door and offered to make a deal, a pot of his cider for a piece of salted meat. You hesitate. Pork is indeed precious, but the sweetness of apples attracts you. Transactions like this have stirred up ripples in the village, weaving a fragile web of common survival. When night fell, you noticed that the flame went out once again. The same fear rises in your chest. You poured a little ale into the bowl and stirred it into a pot of stew. Steam rose gently, carrying malt, smoke and the scent of life. You slowly scooped it up, listening to the sound of the wind slapping against the blinds. Historians have carefully studied old account books and family records, but no one fully agrees on just how intoxicating medieval winters were. Some people believe that the villagers have been in a semi-minus dazed state throughout the season, while others insist that the light beer has hardly blurred their senses. It is certain that each swallow carries not only taste but also life. When you lie down at night, wrapped in rough wool, your breath mixes with that of your family. The taste of ale still lingers faintly on your tongue. It can eliminate hunger, relieve fear and bring you one step closer to spring. Because in the winter of the Middle Ages, survival did not depend on feasts or comfort. It is served in a spoonful of sour malt liquor, faintly glowing in the glow of the fire, reminding you that even in the toughest season, there is something to sip, to share, and to keep you alive. The smell of last night's beer lingered in the air, but dawn pushed you to the next worry on your list: animals. Because in the winter of the Middle Ages, survival was not confined to your own stomach. List depends on the 4-legged animals bleeding and snoring in the cold. When you walk into the yard, you will hear them first and then see them. The flock of sheep dragged their steps uneasily, their breath curling up like smoke coming out of their noses. The cow walked very low, stomping on the frozen ground with its hooves. The chickens cackled in protest, and their feathers fluttered into balls in the wind. These animals are the key to the survival of a family. Without them there would be no milk, no wool, and no fertilizer to fertilize the fields next year. They are treasures with hooves and feathers, and their care is as heartless as the cold. You take the cow in directly into the hut. Yes, this sounds absurd, but for many farmers, livestock share living space with people in the deep winter. The cow's body, like a natural stove, emits heat, transforming this 1-room house into a barn filled with warmth, scents and noise. You overlooked the stench because ham ilk meant that your child might get something more nutritious than cereal. Historical records clearly show that in harsh weather conditions, bringing animals indoors is a standard practice. In the Scandinavian peninsula and the Scottish Highlands, people designed longhouses where humans and animals lived under the same roof, separated only by a wooden partition. The heat from the cow adds a precious temperature to the indoor air, enough to determine the balance between frostbite and survival. There is a strange custom here. When the frost was at its worst, some families dressed their sheep in rough cloth clothes. This is not because people think these animals look fashionable, but because sand sheep need an extra layer of protection to prevent them from dying in the snow. The sand sheep were originally supposed to have their spring fur ruined. Imagine a yard full of sheep wearing medieval sweaters. Strange but practical. You scatter a bundle of hay in the corner. The hay smells of dust and has a faint sweet taste. The memories of the fields last summer are now being rationed bite by bite. Every time you throw a fork into the trough, It feels like taking gold out of your store. If you say too much, you'll run out before spring. If there is too little, your animals will become weak and their milk and meat will decrease. Mathematics is cruel and there is very little room for error. The children helped. They drove the chickens into a straw enclosure, and their little hands were red from the cold. A person slipped and fell. Despite the pain, the laughter was still boiling. Even in winter, farm work remains a part of children's daily routine. But what was the health condition of the livestock during the months of confinement? Scholars do not fully agree. Some people have pointed out that the skeletal remains show developmental delays, indicating that malnutrition and constriction are very common. Others, however, believe that farmers have a good understanding of their livestock and can balance their rations and keep them healthy. Perhaps, just like human beings, fate is changeable. Some families raise fat cattle, while others raise emaciated and coughing ones. As time went by, you noticed that the cow was steaming in the corner, and its flanks were warm in the cold air. You carefully milked her, and every drop of water would make a faint hissing sound in the wooden bucket. Milk is very thin and sometimes turns blue in winter, but you cherish it as if it were green. Mixed with oats, it turns girls into something almost luxurious. A child licked the bucket. His lips cracked and he smiled. Don't forget there are still pigs. If there is one still alive, it is very likely to have been tied up there by the buyer, sniffing the leftovers. Pigs are usually insured to live as long as possible and then slaughtered when the food is too thin. Their fat turns into lard, their intestines into casings, and their bones are cooked into broth. Nothing was wasted. But at the same time, they were noisy roommates, muttering all night long and sometimes stealing a few bites of the straw bedding when they were desperate. The dog was spinning around outside, shivering with thinness but very loyal. They keep watch, scaring off thieves. Sometimes in the cruelest times they themselves become food. Wild cats were running around in the corner of the barn, chasing rats that threatened precious grains. You may never touch them affectionately, but their existence is as precious as that of any servant. In the afternoon, the farmhouse was filled with the vitality of animals who stomped on the ground. Feathers scattered in the corner, the smell, an exciting mixture of fertilizer smoke, and yogurt stuck to everything. You wrinkled your nose, but you know this is the taste of survival. In the evening, when the wind howls again, you curl up on the bed of straw and wool. Your cow moves in the shadows, sheep huddle together, and chickens perch on the rafters. This is the rabbi in the barnyard. The clucking and mooing sounds are mixed with human snoring. Researchers studying the layout of medieval villages are still debating just how common it was to keep animals indoors. Some people believe that in cold regions, this phenomenon is almost universal. Others, however, believe that this is merely the last resort for the poorest families. Ambiguity hangs in the air like frost. Whether indoors or in humble shacks, animals are like firewood, essential for sustaining life. So when the candle burns very low and the storm roars at your door, you fall asleep with the company of your family and animals. Their warmth seeped into the night. Their breaths blend with yours. You realize that in winter, survival has never been a human concern. This is a kind of shared patience. This is a crowded and noisy symphony, and the body refuses to yield to the cold. Another night passed. The animals were moving and purring in the corner of the hut. When you wake up, there is a sour smell of feces in your nose and smoke in your front. But the greater discomfort lies in your skin. Winter not only tests your stomach and the supply of firewood, it will also test every piece of clothing fragment you can collect. Because in this world, warmth is not measured in degrees. It is measured by the number of layers of wool. You reached for your corset coat, which was stiff from the cold and had been hanging all night. This fabric is very rough and rough on the skin. It is woven from thick wool from last spring. Under it, if you are lucky enough to have linen, you will wrap a piece. Then came the cloak, heavy and pungent, filled with the smell of flaxseed oil and sweat. The cold will still seep in, but without these layers, you will turn into an icicle before noon. The records at that time clearly indicated that wool was the best friend of farmers in winter. Unlike linen, it can stay warm even when exposed to moisture, and its greasy fibers are more waterproof than most fabrics of the time. Archaeological discoveries reveal that all the tombs in the entire village were wrapped in simple woolen cloaks, prove that their life and death are both covered with wool. Here is an even stranger detail. Some villagers smeared animal fat to make them more resistant to wind and snow. Imagine putting on a coat that smells like the barbecue from last week. Unpleasant, yes. But when you struggle to fall asleep and can't see the roof, you no longer care about the perfume. Pull your hood, which is usually just a pointed woolen hat called coif, and then tie a piece of cloth around your neck. Gloves are very rare, unless you make them from fragments of animal skin. More often than not, you will tuck your hands into your sleeves and rub them against each other to regain the feeling. Boots, if you have them, are made of leather patched with fur. More commonly, farmers wrap their feet with rags layer by layer until their toes become uneven bundles. You are dragging your feet in the snow like a scarecrow with a sore foot. The children can wear whatever they want. It is usually large old clothes that have been dragged into the mud or cracked at the seams. A child might be wearing a cloak that is 3 sizes larger and struggling to fetch water. The hem has frozen very hard. The mothers kept mending, spinning thread with a spindle and mending under the firelight until their eyes became blurry. Each piece of clothing has stitches from the past dozens of winters. The question of exactly how many pieces of clothing a peasant family owns still divides historians. Some people think that most families only have 1 or 2 sets and wear them frequently until they rot. Others, however, think that spinning and weaving are so ruthless that spare clothes may not be rare. Both literally and metaphorically, the evidence is incomplete. Let's imagine that the village is pieced together from fragments. You stroked the hole in your sleeve with your finger, remembering that the wool had scratched you on last season. However, without it, frostbite would spread rapidly. The chilblains are swollen, red and itchy, and have left scars on your fingers. This is the price of the cold, seeping into the broken gloves. You scratched absent-mindedly, knowing that if you weren't careful, they would split open and bleed. In the corner, your neighbor is tidying up her pleated cloak. Not everyone has fur, but rabbits, foxes, and even cats sometimes find themselves skinned and used to make clothes for those who can afford this luxury. You took a deep breath, half envious because she pulled her hood tight to her ears. Your own hood was drooping, wet and smelled more like smoke than warmth. Their strange winter fashion is a hood with an extremely long tail known as a lip shape. You might see a villager wrap his tail around his neck as a makeshift scarf. Initially as a practical insulating material, it later evolved into a trend. Even monks would wear headgear that was so long that it almost dragged the ground. The combination of fashion and functionality in the medieval version, the hut itself was filled with the smell of damp wool, unwashed corpses and smoked grease. When everyone is crammed inside, wearing the same terms day after day, the air becomes somewhere between the barn and the laundry pile. That no one complained. Complaining won't make spring come any faster. At noon, before going out, you will wrap an extra cloak around your shoulders. The wind caresses the village greenery, and you silently thank the sheep for their sacrifice. Each layer of wool is a prayer for keeping warm. You staggered past those neighbors who looked like bundles of fabric, and their faces were all exposed. Each cloak has been patched up in many ways, just like a patchwork of different winters. However, the function of clothing is no more than that. The night remains cruel. You climbed into bed in your own clothes. The boots were still on the feet and the cloak was still draped over the shoulders. The children went underground with you, their tiny bodies clinging tightly to your side. You two don't look like a family together, but more like a pile of discarded clothes. Your breathing is still mixed in the darkness, and you have lived another night. Archaeologists are still confused about the colors of farmers' clothing. Is winter a sea of brown and grey? Or is it that natural dyes are really that important? Well, red, blue and walnut brown bring some color to the darkness. The fragments we discovered suggest more vitality than you might think, indicating that the villagers not only use warmth, but also brightness where they can afford to fend off the cold season. When the storm is roaring outside, you rub your skin with wool. It itches but has a protective effect. It itches but can save lives. When you turn it over, the fabric clumps and seams creak due 2 years of disrepair. Tomorrow you'll patch up another hole and weave another piece of thread. I hope this dress can last until the very end. because in the winter of the Middle Ages, your cloak was more than just clothing. It is your shield, your blanket, your rule of survival. Though worn out, it is as stubborn as you. And night was long, and the wind rustled the blinds until you swore that the entire hut would be blown up into the sky. You wrap yourself in every layer of rough wool, but the real problem is how to endure long periods of darkness. It turns out that the answer is very simple. Everyone crowded together, sharing the little warmth that the human body could generate. The bed of a medieval farmhouse was by no means an alluring thing. Forget about feather mattresses and clean linen sheets. Instead, you lie in a wooden frame filled with straw or reading materials, sometimes stuffed into a cloth bag, and sometimes simply piled loosely beneath you. Every time you turn around, the straw rustles, and soon it gets wet from sweat, spilled beer and other pests that crawl in. The mouse gnawed on the breadcrumbs nearby. Fleas are jumping merrily in your blanket. You sighed, scratched, and rolled around, but you didn't complain. A bed, even if there are pests, is still a place where one can lie down. Now the whole family is crammed onto the same bed. The children are lying on their sides, with their feet on your ribs. Your spouse is curled up on your back, and a warm breath is blowing on your neck. Sometimes even servants or grandmothers would squeeze into the bed until it was like a pile of wood huddled together to make a fire. It was noisy and crowded there, but in the frozen little house, closeness means survival. Medieval records clearly show the collective sleeping was quite normal for farmers. Not only within families but travelers, servants, and even neighbors might share a bed when space was limited. People sleeping in bed are not necessarily romantic, they are just practical. Sleeping alone in winter is a waste of calories, and wasting calories means taking risks. Here is a strange little note. Some families even stuffed chickens into the corner of the bed. The birds cackled, giving off waves of warmth. Moreover, no one wanted their precious feathers to freeze to death in the night. Imagine that when a hen occasionally pecks at your toes, you are trying to fall asleep. You hide under the blanket. The wool itches, the straw pierces your skin, and the fire in the fireplace crackles. But you won't get up to take care of it, minus when you are sandwiched between two children. The cow hums softly in the couch beside it. There is a smell of smoke, sweat and livestock in the room, but for some reason it turned into a lullaby. Your thoughts wander in your sleep. The darkness is heavy, yet it is shared. But does every farmer sleep like this? Scholars disagree. Some people think that most cabins have only one main sleeping space, while others believe that attics or side platforms allow for more partitioning. The surviving accounts vary greatly, making us wonder how much intimacy or awkwardness there was during those long winter nights. Sleep itself is intermittent. Without an alarm clock, you will wake up naturally in the middle of the night. Medieval villages often experienced segmented sleep. After the first sleep, there was an hour or two of wakefulness, followed by a second round of dozing off. During those dark intervals, you fiddle with the embers, pray in a low voice, or if you feel uneasy, sneak out into the snow to relieve yourself. The stars shone so brightly in the cold sky that they almost pricked your eyes. You're back, with a runny nose and numb toes, diving into the pile of the family like a swimmer jumping into warm water. Lumps formed on the bed, the straw rustled, and there were people coughing. The children wriggled and muttered to themselves in their sleep. The baby sobbed, and the milk soon calmed him down. Even in sleep, the night is filled with sounds. The sounds of breathing, snoring, and staggering bodies formed an orchestra. You sigh in the darkness, grateful that the sound means life. Silence means something else. Sometimes, when the mood is high, the bed turns into a place for whispering stories, ancient folk tales about saints, elves, or heroes who bravely confront this even worse winter. The children listened with wide eyes, their heads resting on their shoulders, while the adults chuckled softly. No matter how narrow a bed is, it has become a theater for survival. When the body is cold, every story is a way to warm the heart. Don't forget there are still bugs. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs thrive on the straw bed. No matter how frequently you shake the mattress or lay it out in the weak winter sun, they will come back. You kept cursing until your skin was burned, but pests are always the winners. Some villagers even sprinkle herbs, lavender, mint, or marijuana in the straw, hoping to drive away pests. This smell might be soothing, even though most bugs ignore it. Your dreams are shattered into pieces by the cracking of the fire or the humming of the cows. Dreaming of the grassland in summer, dreaming of freshly baked bread, dreaming of the sunlight without frost that pricks the eyes. Then you wake up and return to the real world, with a crowded bed and smoky rafters, convinced that you will have to do housework in the cold again the next morning. Historians are still puzzled as to whether collective sleep strengthened the bonds among families or tested the limits of people's patience. Did it bring comfort or breed resentment? The truth, as always, may depend on the family, the village and the specific winter. But one thing is certain, without shared warmth, few people can survive to see spring. So you dug deeper into the garbage dump, ignoring the feeling of the strop oaking your neck and the child's cold feet stepping on your thighs. Close your eyes and let the rhythm of shared breathing carry you away, reminding yourself that in the winter of the Middle Ages, the bed was not merely a place to rest. It is the crucible of meat, the shield against frost, and the night vow of enduring together until the end of the world. Morning quietly returned to the hut again, but it brought not light but a pale grey glow and an equally repulsive chill. You pushed aside the rough woolen cloak wrapped around your body and stretched your body, but the pain was flickering on your fingers and toes. Winter not only makes you feel cold, it will leave a mark on you. You will still have these marks after the snow melts. Your hand has been pricked by an ice knife. When the skin is exposed to damp cold, red and swollen sores will appear. They itch so badly that you almost scratch them, and then they hurt so badly that you feel like vomiting. Children also cry, scratch themselves and roar at night because of the same pain. If the cold gets deeper and deeper, there is a risk of frostbite. The toes turn white, then black, and sometimes never heal. In a village without surgeons, losing a toe is a silent tragedy and is almost regarded as a common occurrence. Chroniclers have left outspoken records of these hardships, describing how villagers limped due to frostbite in winter or continued working with their hams wrapped in rags. The pain is not hidden. This is part of daily life. Here is a terrifying little note. Some people believe that rubbing snow on frost-bitten meat can cure it. Imagine how cruel and ironic it would be to treat a cold wound with more coldness. Sometimes it can restore blood circulation, but it also frequently aggravates the damage. The fire had an effect, though not much. The smoke will sting your lungs and make you cough non-stroke. Diseases in winter can spread easily in narrow cabins. A child sneezed and soon the whole family had their noses running. The cold persists, the fever rises, and you see the weak getting weaker and weaker. You only have herbal therapy left. A garlic was stuffed under the pillow, honey was smeared on the throat, and a hot stone was pressed on the painful stomach. It is the more common cause of death in winter cold or disease. Scholars still have differences. Some people believe that more farmers died from exposure to air than from diseases, while others insist that crowded and smoke-filled environments make respiratory infections the real killers. It was the memory of each harsh winter merged into a long struggle. The evidence became blurred. You stir a pot of light soup, with steam rising gently, as if trying to drive away despair. The taste is mild, but the heat soothes your throat. Around you, the neighbors dragged in, their faces pale, their lips crack, each with the same tired look. A child coughed so hard that his eyes were watering. An old man was still trembling despite having layers of wool wrapped around his back. The thatched cottage was filled with a strong smell of sweat, disease, smoke and the soreness of wet straw. You press the herbs into a bundle and hang them on the rafters, hoping that they will sweeten the air. Perhaps it succeeded, perhaps it didn't. But this act itself is like a contempt for this season. Some diseases flare up more severely in winter. In a damp environment, fever intensifies, coughing worsens, and joint pain intensifies. The villagers whispered that winter fever was a mysterious disease that occurred every year during the frost. No one knows the exact reason, but everyone is afraid of hearing the endless coughing in the dark. You sat by the stove, wrapping your sore hands in cloth. The children crowded around you, their eyes moistened, their noses red. You whispered stories to distract them, and your voice became rough because of the smoke. In this season, health is not merely about thriving. This is about persistence, maintaining breathing in the lungs, and preventing bones from breaking in the cold. And so the long night passed, filled with coughing, scratching, trembling and praying. Your body has turned into a battlefield against winter. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. But every morning when you wake up, you survive again in the endless battle between your body and the frost. Now, the salted meat bucket has almost been scraped to the bottom. The onions have withered into terrifying shells, and even the radishes in the cellar taste more like earth than sweet. The cold lingers on, the snow still covers the field, and your stomach growls like an animal that refuses to be soothed. Hunger intensified into despair. You find yourself looking at leftovers with a fresh perspective. A bread crust as hard as a stone becomes precious. It can be soaked in warm water and chewed slowly, as if it were a feast. The granary was swept bare and every grain was picked out, but the house still wasn't full. At this point, you start looking for things that you wouldn't even dare to dream of eating in summer. Records from the late Middle Ages mention, but villagers scraped bark from trees, ground it and mixed it with flour. The taste is not very good. It tastes almost nothing like food, but it increases the volume of the dough, making the body mistakenly think it has eaten more. Some people also roast acorns, soak them to remove the bitterness, and then grind them into coarse powder. The stomach is very uncomfortable, but what's even more uncomfortable is making the children cry hungry. This is a surprising marginal note. Mice sometimes become part of the diet. Not often, and certainly not with pride, but in the worst years farmers would trap them, peel them and cook them into stews. Hunger dispelled hesitation, and the memory of fullness triumphed over disgust. You stroll through the snow-covered forest, looking for anything to eat. Frozen berries, bitter green vegetables hidden under frost, roots that can be dug out from hard soil. Every small discovery is like a treasure. Some villagers chew dried nettle or hemp seeds on the tough crust of old cheese. Even the bones preserved from the autumn slaughter are ground into broth. The faint smell of bone marrow turns hot water into a luxury. But how common is the famine every winter? Experts disagree. Some people believe that years of meticulous storage mean that farmers can endure hunger. Some people have also pointed out that whenever the harvest is poor, the food crisis recurs, depicting winter as a season of constant fear. The truth may lie among many winters with growling stomachs, but the worst winters have left deep scars in memory. You brought home the spoils of war, a bundle of bitter and shriveled acorns. But they were still food after all. You smashed them with stones, soaked them in water, and then cooked them into a thick brown paste. The smell is pungent, earthy and annoying, but when you scoop it out with a spoon, the children's eyes will light up. They eat very greedily, not because they like to eat, but because it means they won't go to bed hungry. The neighbors whispered that the situation at home was even worse. Some people's granaries were empty by mid-January. It is said that another family, out of desperation, slaughtered their only cow. You lowered your head, tightly grasping the bundle of acorn jam, reminding yourself that survival often means swallowing shame while eating. Fill a small room. The smell of meat stewed with boiled tree bark and acorns was very strong. This is not the taste of comfort. This is the taste of patience. You close your eyes, scoop the rough food into your mouth and tell yourself that you can hold on for another day. Because in the winter of the Middle Ages, hunger would teach you a lesson that no feast could teach you. As long as the pressure of the cold is great enough, you can almost eat anything. If the snow doesn't melt, you can chew tree bark and mice for dinner. The acorn soup you had last night felt very heavy in your stomach. This sense of hunger has never truly vanished. Everyone in the village has this feeling. You can see from the pale and haggard faces of your neighbors that their eyes are looking for hope with every step they take. That the winter in the Middle Ages was not lonely. They lived together in groups, turning their needs into habits. This day begins with walking into the public oven. Not every family has enough firewood to bake bread in their own fireplace. Instead, the villagers collect their dough, and no matter what the mixture of flour, peas or chestnuts is, they can take it to the large oven in the center of the settlement. The oven glowed slightly and smoke came out of the mouth. One family after another queued up, chatting in low voices and stamping their feet to keep warm. The bread goes in, and the runes come out. Written records confirm that in most parts of medieval Europe, especially in smaller communities, sharing ovens was very common. Its approach saves fuel, enhances efficiency, and intensifies the sense that winter is a collective test. Everyone relies on the same fire. Era's a charming narrator. While waiting for the bread, people sometimes share a small cup of hot drink or exchange messages about who is mocking whom. Even in the barren months, the oven becomes a warm place for humans, just like physical heat. You imagine the villagers wrapped in patched cloaks, smiling in their cold breaths, and finding a glimmer of joy in the shadow of scarcity. Later, you walk to the barn where several families have agreed to put their animals together. It is not only efficient, but also safer. Cows huddled together share their body temperature, while shepherds take turns to guard against wolves that might crawl down from the woods. At these moments, the village is like a family. Trust and responsibility link survival together. However, not all cooperations are pleasant. Beneath the surface lies tension. Who contributed more firewood? Whose chickens eat more public feed? When the bread came out of the oven, every household looked at each other's bread doubtfully, muttering that when someone else's money was put in, it looked even larger. Sharing is survival, while suspicion is the shadow of winter. Archaeologists studying the layout of settlements point out that proximity is not only for convenience, but also a strategy. The houses are built very close to each other so that they can shield each other from the wind. The narrow path was covered with snow, but it was also filled with warmth. However, scholars are in dispute over exactly how many resources the villagers have actually utilized. Are they bound by generosity or driven by despair? The evidence leaves room for both possibilities. When night falls, you find yourself invited to your neighbor's house. The fireplace was brightly lit and the room was crowded with people. Despite their rumbling hunger, they were still laughing and chatting merrily. The children gathered together and played games in the straw, while the adults passed around a can of light beer. Someone told a story. Another one was humming a tune. For a moment, the cold was forgotten. The community becomes a stronger insulator than any cloak. After a while, you return to the darkness, your cheeks flushed with warmth and companionship. The snow was creaking beneath my feet, but the silence in the village was no longer so heavy. Behind each tightly closed window lies another family, another pile of fire, and another pot of emaciated girl. You realize that the only way for people to get through winter is to rely on each other, not just sharing food and fire, but also gifts. Because in this season, survival doesn't merely depend on how much you stockpile. The criterion for measuring it is who will open the door when the night becomes long. When your firewood runs out, who will share their oven? When the bread is slowly toasted in the sun, who will sit beside you chatting? The days grew increasingly hazy, one gloomy morning after another, and one light dinner after another. However, throughout the entire process, the rhythm of religion beat steadily, determining when you eat, when you fast, and even what you are allowed to chew when the food supply is insufficient. Here, faith is more important than comfort. It is a calendar, a rationing tool, and sometimes a cruel master. You know the rules. Don't eat meat on Fridays. During Lent, the 40-day fast is more unbearable than frost. The villagers made do with fish, beans and flatbread. Even though the salted meat was still alluring in the bucket, the monks shouted loudly in their sermons about the danger of overeating and reminded everyone that hunger was sacred. You chew on the light soup, trying to believe it. The records of the contemporary church clearly illustrate how detailed these food laws were. The entire community arranges its diet around Ramadan, and it goes without meat for nearly 1/3 of the year. In winter, when the stomach is already groaning from emptiness, these rules must feel particularly heavy. There's a strange twist here. Loophole. In some areas, villagers believe that beavers are also considered fish. After all, it has a tail and lives in the river. So roasted beaver tails appear on the tables of those who are lucky enough to catch beavers and are eaten without any sense of guilt during Lent. Elsewhere, it is said that barnacle geese grow out of driftwood, which makes them not entirely birds. The creativity of the Middle Ages in changing the rules of fasting was both creative and desperate. You knelt in the church, breathing in the cold air. The candles flickered on the stone wall, and the priest chanted prayers around you, casting shadows. The neighbors coughed and sniffed. Their sunken cheeks were illuminated by the flickering light. The scent of incense contrasts with that of damp wool, creating a mixed mist that makes you sway in your sleepiness. Religion will not stop, it will keep moving forward. But how strictly do ordinary farmers observe fasting in practice? Researchers still have differences. Some people think that the church strictly forces them to repent every time they make a mistake. Others, however, believe that when hunger became unbearable, the villagers quietly violated the rules by eating the prohibited meat scraps behind the tightly closed blinds. Truth may be as gloomy as the winter sky, partly compliant and partly quite rebellious. Even festivals are a double minus-edged sword. Christmas or Epiphany promises to be celebrated. However, food often has to cover the entire village. Each household brings together their best food minus an extra piece of bread, a piece of pork, a pot of cider minus, and shares it at the communal meal. One night, the hunger lessened and the singing reached the rafters. When the children saw the rare honey cake, their eyes lit up. However, the next morning you returned to your thingdale, and the contrast between the two was even stronger than the frost outside. At home, try to cook within the prescribed range. A pot of beans was bubbling on the stove, with a pinch of dried herbs from last summer added. The children frowned because they had no meat, but you calmed them down and reminded them that fasting would bring blessings. In fact, you know that blessings won't come the raw in their stomachs. However, repeating this sentence will also bring you comfort, as if holiness can fill the void that food cannot. When you swallowed this light meal, you heard the faint chimes coming from the church. They mark the hours, days, and the endless march of time. Religious beliefs not only determine your way of eating, but also how you measure each long winter moment. The church calendar has become the village clock, providing structure in this season. Otherwise, the days would become blurred. So you sip the bean soup, chew on the rye bread crust, and bow your head in prayer. Whether you believe in every word or not, faith brings rhythm to hunger, making it feel less like chaos, but more like sacrifice. Perhaps this pace is part of the reason why you have survived. Yesterday's fast and solemn prayers still linger in your bones. But today, this village is alive with a different kind of energy. Winter is long, harsh, and monotonous. Sometimes survival doesn't just depend on bread and broth. It depends on the happy moment, which might sound strange. Therefore, when the river freezes or the snow piles up high enough, the villagers will turn their pain into joy. Imagine standing on a frozen river under the pale sunlight. The river surface sparkles like glass. At first, you walked carefully, trying every step you took, but soon the ice proved thick enough. The children slid across the road, screaming and laughing, while the adults set up makeshift stalls. The frost market has already begun. Although it is not held every year and not in every village, it often flashes in people's memories. Centuries later, the chroniclers' descriptions of these events are most famous. However, in areas where waterways are severely frozen, there are smaller versions. Brewer night, stalls selling roasted chestnuts, coarse malt liquor or hand-minus carved trinkets emerged, transforming the frozen surface into a bustling market. At that moment, winter became festive rather than cruel. There is a strange prosperity here. Sometimes villagers roast eels on ice. Their greasy meat crackles in the open air. People eat them with numb fingers, stomping their feet to keep warm. It wasn't a luxurious dinner, but it was novel enough to engrave this day in memory. You also joined in, clumsily dragging your feet on the ice. Your boots slipped, your arms flailed, and you couldn't help but laugh. The music rose, perhaps just the sounds of drums and flints, the simplest band, but the sound spread across the frozen fields. The couple spins clumsily, the children are chasing each other. The neighbors greeted each other loudly. For several hours, the gloom and monotony brought by hunger and cold vanished, replaced by shared joy. But how common are such winter festivals outside big cities? Scholars are still arguing about this to this day. Some people believe that most villages lack resources or security and are unable to host any well-planned events. Others, however, believe that even the smallest communities have invented their own recreational activities, such as sledding down from the mountains, running on ice, and holding strength races in the snow. After all, happiness is as creative as need. You stopped and took a sip of warm cider from the wooden cup, with steam enveloping your face. The sweetness pricks your tongue, reminding you that not every winter is bitter. Beside you, children are eating honey cakes bought from small stalls. Their cheeks were red from the cold, and their laughter filled the air like the songs of birds. This time you feel full, not in your stomach, but in your spirit. The market won't last long. Frost sting or supply depletion, or the priest shaking his head at frivolity. However, even though it has ended, the memories still linger, retold in the firelight, as if it were a dream. Do you still remember the day when we danced on the ice? Some people might say, at that moment warmth returned to the room, because in the cruel winters of the Middle Ages, happiness was not merely about distraction. This is contempt. Every laugh on the frozen river surface, every piece of cake shared in the cold, and every awkward spin accompanied by the sound of a pipe, all proclaim the same truth. Even in hunger, even in the bitter cold, life still persists on. The laughter at the frost market soon died away, and the alley fell silent again. Winter always reminds you that happiness is fleeting and danger exists forever. This year, rumors spread in the village that someone in the neighboring town died of blackened and swollen bodies. This sentence spreads like frost on glass. Plague. Although the Black Death was not confined to winter, this season magnified its terror. The air itself feels different. People cough more severely in cold months. Every sneeze and every fever raises suspicion. You watched your neighbor coughing non-stop, wondering whether it was the cold of an ordinary winter or something worse. His eyes flashed rapidly. Pray softly. Fear sharpens the frost. The chronicles of the Middle Ages record that during cold months, when people crowded into smoke-filled and poorly ventilated cabins, the epidemic often worsened. The crowded and dirty environment creates a perfect breeding ground for diseases. The mice were running around under the floor. Fleas are jumping around on the straw bed. People crowded together, which was exactly the kind of environment that plagues liked. Here is a chilling detail. Some villagers believe that the smell of burning herbs can prevent plagues. People threw juniper, rosemary and even bundles of hay into the fire to purify the air. The hut was filled with suffocating smoke. The eyes are weeping, the lungs are burning, but fear still exists. You walked out, and the silence was heavier than before. The green space in the village is deserted. There was no laughter or joy, no games. The door was tightly closed, and smoke rose lazily from the chimney. When someone passes away, the church bells ring slowly and you will see a person wearing a hood pushing a rough wooden cart. The ground is too hard to dig, so the tomb is very shallow. The permafrost withstands every shovel. The sound of iron hitting stone echoes in your chest, like a warning. But historians are still debating exactly how winter affected the spread of the Black Death. Some people point out that there are records showing that the outbreak of the epidemic slows down in the coldest months, while others emphasize that famine and dense population make winter particularly deadly. The evidence remains vague, just like the memory itself. In your little house, you are closer to your family. Every cough should be carefully examined. Every feverish cheek was touched and touched, as if comfort could dispel fear. The air was filled with the smell of garlic. Stuff the clothes into the bag and tie it around the children's necks. You hear the charm of whispers. A branch of an aster was pinned to the beam of the house. People seize on any weak defense they can think of. Fear is not merely death itself, but dying in the silence of winter. The villagers were afraid of the frozen cemetery and being carried to the snow. Their names vanished in this already difficult season. Families prayed harder, more closely and more carefully, rationing food because the plague combined with hunger felt like the end of the world. One night the bell rang again, and you stepped into the cold darkness. A small group of people dragged their feet past, torches flickering, and a low cry echoed through the snow. You held your cloak tight and prayed in a low voice, not sure if anyone was listening. The entire village was holding its breath, waiting, fearing and enduring. Because when the Black Death met the winter of the Middle Ages, survival was not merely enduring the cold or hunger. Every morning when you wake up, cough and fall asleep, pray that it's just the smoke in your lungs, not the shadow of death, taking turns to come to your door. The fear of the plague lingers in your chest. But life goes on, especially for the children in the village. Winter was the toughest for them, but they also brought the brightest light of resistance. Their little voices, Their games and their laughter pierced through the cold. All these remind us that not every moment is dominated by fear. You watch them roll down into the snow, their cloaks flapping like wings, and their cheeks red from the frost. They were either in boots or barefoot with their feet wrapped in rags, chasing each other in the frozen fields. The screams echoed, and throughout the village, there was a sound that was both fragile and intense. Even when hungry, children can still find ways to play. Contemporary works have mentioned these games. Simple pastimes, such as throwing snowballs, sliding across frozen ponds, or carving toys with wood shavings. A stick turned into a sword, a piece of ice and a makeshift ball. Winter shrinks the world, but imagination expands it. Here is a strange little note. Some children make ice bones. They were rolling popsicles like dice. This game is half about playing and half about fortune minus telling. It's a way to predict one's luck for the coming year. Who would look for food? Who will get married? Who might not survive until spring? Even in games, survival has never been far from their minds. That childhood in winter is not just about playing. Work is equally important, perhaps even more important. At dawn, you will see little hands carrying buckets of ice water from the well, shoulders bending over to carry piles of firewood, and fingers pulling straw as bedding. The children scattered grains for the chickens, swept the snow off the path and took care of the goats tied near the hut. Their laughter mingled with coughing, their play with household chores, until you realize that both are intertwined on the same day. How heavy are these burdens? Scholars still have differences. Some people believe that the children of farmers are constantly studying, and their gains are being snatched away by the stolen time. Others, however, believe that compared with summer labor, winter has shorter days and agricultural cultivation comes to a halt, giving them more time to play. The truth, like snow itself, may exist in constantly changing layers. Happy today, tired tomorrow. In the small house, you see children crowded around the fireplace. They shared a piece of bread crust, giggling while dipping it in light beer, pretending that it was a grand banquet. They told stories, sometimes about saints and sometimes about foolish animals, their eyes wide open in the flickering firelight. The smoke made them cough, but the light in their eyes did not fade in the slightest. Later on, you tuck a person into the bed and drap him in a patchwork cloak that still smells like sheep. His fingers work old and his stomach wasn't very full, but his breathing was steady as he fell asleep. For a moment, a calm expression appeared on his face. You glanced at the others huddled together, their straw rustling as they moved, wondering how many winters they would endure. Heavy thoughts lingered on, but you calmed them down. They'll be here tonight. In some villages, there are even organized games on winter nights, such as sliding down from snow capped mountains for competitions, simulating battles with straw bundles, and riddles given by candlelight. A traveling storyteller might use stories about knights and dragons to capture children's attention, their voices drowning out the crackling of the fire. The story wrapped them in a warmth that no cloak could match. You know all too well that childhood in winter is a gamble. Frost bite the toes. Hunger hinders growth. Disease takes away the weak. However, the children were still laughing, still playing, and still shouting across the frozen pond. Their voices broke the silence of the snow. The grand chorus of survival refuses to be quiet. So you watch them in tattered clothes, chasing each other in the white fields, and their joy shines bright and distinct under the dim sky. You will realize that even in the toughest seasons, life will find a way to laugh. The children's laughter echoed in the snow. Not every voice in the village can bring joy. Anger turns into despair, and despair sometimes turns into crime. Winter is always the most barren season. When the cabinets are emptied, morality will become as thin as a girl in a pot. You hear the whisper first. The meat of someone in the public warehouse is gone. A piece of pork held up at night. The neighbors were buzzing unfull of suspicion, their eyes fixed on the poorest farmhouse. Cold makes people more sensitive, more prone to anger and less likely to forgive. Thefts in summer might be overlooked. Theft in winter may ruin a family. Court records from the Middle Ages confirm that thefts tend to surge in the coldest months. The grains in the barn were stolen, the wood on the hedge was stolen, and even the clothes on the clothesline were piled up. Being caught for taking someone else's bread, is a crime of survival, that one will still be severely punished. Here's the darker, gossip news. People sometimes attribute the pain of winter to witches. When animals fall ill or children become thin, suspicion turns to the old woman who lives on the edge of the village. Accusations rise along with frost, and fear dropped as accusations more than evidence. To her eyes, eager to find a scapegoat, the pot of herbs beside the fire might seem like witchcraft. You passed through the magic gate and saw a figure tied to a wooden bolt, her hand roaring from the cold. Perhaps she stole the wood, perhaps she was just unfortunately accused. The villagers took a quick look, some with pity and some with a strong sense of satisfaction. The justice of winter is as ruthless as the weather itself. But how common were witchcraft trials in the Middle Ages compared to the following centuries? Historians still dispute this. Some people believe that accusations were rare before the great panics of the 16th and 17th centuries, while others think that there is a great deal of evidence suggesting that suspicion began to brew a long time ago. Arguments are like the smoke on the beams of a house, always present, but never completely clear. In your hut, you are now more closely guarding your storage, moving the barrels and sacks towards the fireplace, where you can see them. You exchange vigilant glances with your neighbor, weighing trust against hunger. At night, you lock the door even tighter, although a determined thief can still pry it open effortlessly. However, crime is not always theft. Sometimes quarrels turn into violence, all because of firewood, the right to graze, or simply to utter a harsh word in the dark. Winter gnaws at patience until it collapses. The village head or the bailiff stepped in to impose fines or order close, but this resentment lingered on for a long time. For you still remember a story your grandfather once told? One winter was extremely cold and the villagers began to steal radishes from the church field. The priest scolded them angrily, but he also needed to eat, so when the leftovers were gone, he turned a blind eye. After all, when the pressure of hunger is great enough, justice is flexible. Tonight, the snow has thickened again. You lie in bed, listening to the footsteps outside. The dog barked weakly, and its ears stung. You held the cloak tighter, both sympathizing with the hungry thief and fearing that your family might be the next. In winter, every villager is both a victim and a suspect, both a watchman and a potential criminal. Because in the long frozen night, when the stomach grows and the fire is very low, even the slightest theft feels like violence, while justice, swift and brutal, becomes another kind of survival. A survival more cruel than the cold itself. The whispers of theft and punishment lingered in the air. But winter does not merely intensify suspicion. It stripped the village bare, revealing its hierarchical system. When resources become scarce, you start to clearly see who eats first, who waits, and who doesn't. Mana faintly emerges at the edge of the settlement, with its stone walls towering above the drooping huts. Inside, the lord's family sat by a larger fire, wrapped in more delicate furs, with bread, cheese and bacon still placed on the table. Meanwhile, in your one-room home, the family members are staring at a pot of watery broth. This contrast is as sharp as the cold. The remaining account books of the memorial estate reveal this serious imbalance. The lords stored up more reserves of grain and meat, while the peasants contributed through and rent, labor and taxes. They often had to beg for relief in years of famine. Standing outside the manager's door in winter, grasping your hat with numb fingers, is both an insult and a necessity. Here is a small note explaining the problem. When the lord's family held a banquet, leftovers such as pie crusts, ground bones and pudding fragments were sometimes given to the servants. Because a hungry farmer was allowed to enter the hall, those leftovers taste like miracles. At that moment, a dog licking the grease on the floor might be your opponent. Back in the village, the hierarchical system became even stricter. Families with larger land or more livestock distribute food more carefully. They might lend their food or seeds to their neighbors, but they always have to pay a certain price and repay it with labor when spring comes. Those who have nothing are getting weaker and weaker, their children are getting thinner and thinner, and their patience is getting shorter and shorter. How strict is this hierarchical system? Scholars are different. Some people believe that communities are more equal than we imagine, and neighbors support each other in times of crisis. Others, however, emphasize the harshness of feudal membership fees, with the peasant bearing the heaviest burden. Facts usually change with regions and environments, but inequality has never completely disappeared. In a public oven, you will notice the differences. The bread of a family is thick and golden. You look flat and grey. People glanced at it but said nothing. Silence speaks louder than words. Everyone has hunger, but wealth still determines who sleeps more soundly. In your little house, you heard someone say that the manor received a gift to beg for mercy. A chicken, a bag of beans, a promise, extra labor, when the field withers. God's mercy was praised on the pulpit. But you know, it's not so much generosity as a deal. The survival of the poo is always borrowed rather than owned by themselves. Even among farmers, the hierarchical system emerged. Reeve, who was chosen to supervise the village's labor force, might eat a little better than his neighbors. A wealthy farmer might even hide a small piece of salted meat when someone else is chewing the bark. He carefully observed these subtle differences, as they determine who will cough all night and still has enough fat to keep warm. However, resentment is seldom openly expressed. Winter is too heavy to waste energy on rebellion. On the contrary, it's simmered quietly, murmuring in the bitter smiles of those who spoke by the stove. You know inequality. You can feel it. But survival requires patience. Spring will bring labor fees. When harvesting, 1/10 should be taken. Such a cycle will continue. So tonight you curl up on your straw bed, and the roar in your stomach is louder than the wind outside. You imagine the candles in the magic hole still burning, and the meat in the gutter still being passed around to each other. You swallow your jealousy along with your thin soup, because in winter, the hierarchy is not merely social, is a clear rule for survival, with whoever eats being the one to wait. And you, like many others, are waiting, hoping that it will be your turn before the hunger ends. But hunger was growing stronger and stronger, and people were increasingly aware that not everyone in the village was bearing the same weight. Beyond the reefs or the wealthy farmers, the true balance of power lies on the mountains and in the manors. Its stone walls are like a well-fed fortress, reminding people that when you rationed the leftovers, the lord and his family were dining by candlelight at the long wooden table. On a bitter morning, you struggled through the city gate and saw the servants carrying bags of grain from the storerooms, which were large enough to make your little house look like a cupboard. Smoke drifted lazily out of the chimney of the manor. It was not the faint cough in the bushes, but the steady feather sound of the tempered logs. The room was ablaze with flames. The warmth you long for is endless for the person within you. Estate records across Europe show that lords often stored large quantities of wheat, bacon, cheese and malt liquor. These are not merely luxury goods. They are insurances accumulated by farmers like you from rent and membership fees. When famine struck, the lords could survive comfortably, while the tenants could only beg. This is a system built on an unbalanced foundation, which is as obvious as snow on the roof in winter. Here is a bitter little irony. Sometimes, God would distribute weapons at the church entrance, with slices of bread, a spoonful of porridge, and a few coins falling into his trembling hand. The chroniclers describe how the villagers praised their lord's charity. But you know it was your own labor, and 1/10 of your own has turned to pieces. You walked home with heavy steps, your stomach tense, and heard someone whispering that someone had gone to the manor to beg. Some people came back with a bag of barley, while others got nothing but stern scolding. The mood of the doorman may determine whether your family will eat or not. You will realize that winter is not only a test of endurance, but also a test of negotiating with those in higher positions. But our Lord is always very unfortunate. Researchers still hold different opinions. Some people believe that the hoarding of food by noble families strengthened their control over dependents. Others, however, noticed true generosity. During the famine, the lords opened their granaries to keep the villagers alive. The evidence is still incomplete. Perhaps, just like everything in winter, the truth changes with each social class, each year, and each person's character. This inequality is very serious in your own home. The children asked why the magic lamp was brighter than the fire in the village. If you calm them down and tell them stories about saints and kings, they will repay you with patience. That your voice trembled. You know that when spring comes, you will return to the field of the Lord and fall down under his plough, repaying all that he has given you. Survival itself has become another kind of rent. In the public oven, the differences are revealed again. The butler of the manor came with rod made of fine white flour. The raw flour was soft and tender, while your coarse rye bread cracked like a stone. People glanced at the butler's bread, and jealousy tugged in their hearts. But no one dared to speak. To mock God's bread is to risk one's own bread. The night is getting darker and the wind is getting stronger. In your mind, that magic hall emerges again, with tables piled high with trenches, laughter echoing beneath the wooden beams, and a bard playing in the firelight. Then you glanced at your own hearth. A pot of radish soup was steaming slightly, but only a cough broke the silence. This contrast is as painful as hunger itself. However, resentment did not evolve into rebellion. Not in the depth of winter. Everyone knows the truth. Without the protection of the manor, the village would be unable to resist invaders' wolves. Or even worse, God's storehouse may cause you pain, but it also forms a safety net that you cannot sever. This is a cruel balance, which is strengthened every time your stomach growls and he feasts in the hole. So you curl up under your cloak, smoke into your hair, and tell yourself that spring will break the shackles. Now winter reveals what has always been there. Power gathers in stone walls, wealth is stored in wooden barrels, and farmers wait for mercy outside their gates. Because survival in the winter of the Middle Ages was not merely about tree bark, girls, or firewood. This is also related to the hierarchical system. Under this hierarchical system, the shadow of the manor hung long over the smoke. The shadow of the manor stretched very long. But in these small houses, another truth became clear. Survival in winter largely depends on women's work. When men are dragging wood in snowdrifts or looking after animals in carriages, it is women who turn leftovers into food, rags into clothes, and despair into endurance. Their labor takes up endless time, most of which is unknown and most of which is unpraised. But it is absolutely crucial. You imagine the fireplace at dawn. A woman crouched down, fiddled with the embers with a fire stick, and spewed flames from the ashes. Her fingers were cracked and her nails were blackened by the soot, but she still persisted until the smoke rose again. Then she measured out just enough food for her to eat for a day. She clearly knew how far a handful of food could go and how to silence hunger. Eating too much today may mean being empty tomorrow. Family records and medieval guides show that spinning, weaving, unmending were Ursula's odd jobs, especially in winter when the fields froze over. Women spin wool into thread, twist linen into linen cloth, or wear out patched cloaks from frequent use. Clothes are never disposable. Every coat, every hood and every pair of hose bear the marks of dozens of meticulous repairs. There is a strange, almost humorous note. Sometimes women need sheep faffed into the thread to make it more moisture-minus proof. It gives the clothes a faint smell of lamb, but durability is more important than perfume. Imagine putting on a cloak. It will remind you of the animal from which it comes. You will hear the smooth rhythm of the spinning wheel, or in a poor family, the sound of the spindle falling. This sound turned into winter music, a faint sound of wool being distorted. This is a person's sigh, knowing that there is still an endless sky to spin. The children help sort out the fibers. Their little hands work ending the knots, while the mother and daughter had no claws spinning. But how much control do women have over the survival of their families? Scholars are still debating. Some people believe that wives make almost all the choices regarding food, clothing and rationing, while others think that men still dominate the larger decisions. The truth may shift from family to family, but winter makes Swinen the center of daily endurance. In the evening, it was the same women sitting by the fireplace, mending sock holes and cloaks, sewing by the flickering candlelight until their eyes blued. Their voices whispered lullabies, stories, or prayers, while the needles flickered faintly in the light. The coughing of the children couldn't stop their hands. The repair is still ongoing, for the frost does not wait for comfort. You will notice how women manage to elongate even the tiniest fragments. Cook a thick broth with a handful of beans. A cloak patched with 2 kinds of wool. A children's coat turned inside out of an old coat. Intelligence and talent become the shield against despair. Neighbors were sharing gossip in a spinning circle, and women were gathering together to work in the dim light. They exchanged news, exchanged threads, complained about sore fingers and laughed at their clumsy husbands. In this circle, survival is a collective feeling, which is bound together by friendship and wool. Nevertheless, the burden is still very heavy. The cold seeped into the bones, the smut irritated the lungs, and hands swelled from the ice skates. However, women seldom stop, for stopping means breaking the line between warmth and destruction. So when you look around the cottage, you can see their marks everywhere. The patched cloak on your shoulder, the broth in the bowl, and the child sleeping in the mended blanket. All of these are silent witnesses to their work, because in the harsh winter of the Middle Ages, survival was not as heroic as the song imagined. It is patient, repetitive, and invisible labor, twisting thread into yarn, cooking fragments into dinner, and pouring love into every piece of land. Women carry winter with their fingers without fingers. Frost would devour everyone. The gentle rhythm of the spinning wheel and the crackling of the fireplace echoed in the farmhouse. That beyond the rural green spaces lies another world at endurance minus monasteries. Below, the monks concealed their suffering with prayers and rituals. The impact of winter on the monastery was as heavy as that on the farmhouses. You can imagine that stone Midas-built monastery, with its high walls covered in frost and water droplets condensed on the windows, and rows of figures in cloaks moving slowly in the cold. Entering the corridor, you will immediately feel a bone-minus chilling cold. Stones can retain frost, just as sponges can retain water. The flagstones beneath my feet were wet. The corridor was drafting, and the sound of the wind blowing in echoed through the ceiling. The monks wore woolen clothes, and simple sandals of boots on their feet, and their breathing was clearly visible when they chanted. The air was filled with the smell of beeswax candles, damp wool and ink drying in the writing room. The rules of the temple require strict prayers to be held every morning and evening. Even in the depth of winter, monks would get up in the dark hours before dawn, trembling as they filed into the chapel. Records from Benedictine churches show that the vigil was held at temperatures close to freezing, with voices trembling from the cold, but with a firm dedication. There is an unusual detail here. Some monasteries only allow their monks to wear gloves when praying, not when working, to remind them that comfort is secondary discipline. Imagine copying a manuscript in a writing room with your fingers so stiff that you can't even hold a quill pen. My hands were shivering, with cold and covered with ink stains. Monks relied on gardens, fish ponds and warehouses to support themselves. But even their abundant supplies would become barren in bad use. Meals are often reduced to thin porridge, stale bread and malt liquor as light as what farmers drink. However, they wrapped these hardships in holiness, regarded hunger as a form of fasting, and saw coldness as a test of humility. The rhythm of prayer gives meaning to a life that originally felt painful. That compared with rural areas, how much suffering did the monks really endure? Scholars still have differences. Some people believe that monasteries with larger manors and better planning can spend the winter more comfortably. Others, however, point out the strict aesthetic rules require people to deliberately feel uncomfortable, which makes their winters colder than those of farmers outside. The truth may vary. A wealthy monastery might be indulging in feasts, while a more rigorous monastic would be shivering in tattered robes. By around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the writing room was filled with the scraping sound of quill pens. The air above the desks was filled with the scent of breathing. The candles crackled in the through wind, and the monks' hoods were drawn even deeper. Their ink would freeze if not covered for too long, so a brother placed the ink bottle beside a candle to heat it up and then handed it back. The words and scriptures of the saints marched on the parchment, which was a challenge to darkness and cold. Meanwhile, in the infirmary, a monk was pressing herbs into a mortar, and the aroma of rosemary and garlic wafted towards him. He would compress them into cloth and wrap it around his chilblain's feet, or mix them in soup to treat a cough in the throat. Here, medicine, prayer and charity are intertwined. For the monastery, not only serves the monks, but also the village inn provides relief to the lords. In the evening, the death knell rang again, calling on the community to pray. You imagine a long, dim chapel with the air filled with incense and frost. The monks chanted hymns, their voices reverberating on the stones, deep and steady. This sound vibrates like warmth itself, reminding you that survival can also be spiritual, not just physical. You leave the monastery site in your imagination. The smoke from the village appears thin and fragile compared to the monastery belt are standing in the snow. But you know, both of these places are facing the same predicament. Whether wearing a wooden cloak or coarse clothes, living by the stove or confined in a room, enduring the winter means being physically weak, but mentally tenacious. Even behind the stone walls, even with the rhythm of prayer guiding them, the monks felt the frostbite equally strongly. Their hymns echoed in the frozen corridors, becoming another way for every villager to whisper quietly at night, "Let's live to see spring." The bells of the monastery fade away behind you, but the broader world seems even more distant. Winter is not merely about hunger and cold. It also cut off all connections between the village and the winding alleys. The path was covered with snow. The flood froze into uneven obstacles. The former trade routes have turned into dead ends. You live on a frosty island, not bound by water but by the weather. Imagine walking to the next town. This road is nothing but mud in summer and turns into ruts and dice in winter. The ridge is as sharp as a blade beneath one's feet. Your boots are slipping, your knees are hurting, and the wind is scratching your face. Large vehicles cannot pass. The wheels cracked on the frozen ruts. Merchants who once brought salt, cloth or iron will not disappear until spring. The market was silent and the stalls were abandoned. Medieval travel records often mention this seasonal pause. When heavy snow blocked the way, pilgrims, merchants, and even messengers slowed down, or even came to a complete stop. A village curled up on itself, relying on whatever it managed to store. Here is a strange detail. In some places, impossible paths are marked with evergreen branches, warning travelers not to take risks. This is a medieval version of the road sign, with green setting off white. Isolation is not merely physical. The letter has not arrived. The news broke down and rumors spread everywhere. Will the situation in the next village be good or bad? Is the king still alive? Has a war broken out beyond the mountain? You won't know until the thunder god comes. The world shrinks to a circle of farmhouses, a small church and a silent field under the snow. But how isolated were the villagers in the Middle Ages? Indeed, historians still have differences of opinion. Some people believe that many people are closely bound by the local trade network and can survive even in bad weather. Others, however, emphasize the remoteness of rural communities, arguing that they may have no contact with the outside world for weeks or months. Perhaps facts are like snow, they fall heavily in some years and lightly in others. You stand by the frozen stream, gazing at the path leading to the market town. Silence presses on your ears. There was no jingling of horse gear, no cries of merchants, and neither crows circling overhead. Absence is its own voice, as if the outside world has stopped breathing. In the small house, the lack of business became very obvious. There is less and less salt. Without it, food spoils faster. Hand tools are very blunt and cannot be sharpened properly. The fabric cannot be replaced, so the number of rags and patches has multiplied. Without it, even news feels like a resource. You feel insignificant, cut off from the great story outside the door. One night, you dreamed that the road was reopened. A vendor came here with bright ribbons and strange spices, and laughter filled the market square. When you woke up, you were still the same, with a thick layer of snow on the roof and a howling wind blowing through the chimney. So you just turn inward like everyone in the village. The neighbors relied on each other because no one else came. Shared oven, shared barn, shared prayer. They not only become habits, but also necessities. Winter tells you that the village is a ship wrapped in ice. Every solar panel must paddle together, even if it is only hope that paddles. Because in the cold months, the outside world gradually turns into rumors, and the issue of survival becomes a simple question: can your village survive on its own until the road is reopened? The road was covered with snow. A village was cut off, but not everyone is helpless. In the silent winter, animals are not merely possessions. They are allies, saviors, and repositories of warmth and food. Listen before you see. The low mooing of cows, the bleating of sheep, and the steady snorting of horses as they stomp their feet in the frost. Every sound is reminding you that without these creatures, your family's chances of getting through the winter would be extremely slim. Let's start with the horse. Sturdy and with a rough coat, they stood on the buyer's side, and steam rose from their side. Their power is useless on frozen land, but they remain crucial, transporting timber, pulling sleds on icy ground, and even occasionally dragging sick villagers to the monastery when their feet are too weak to walk. In the chronicles, horses are often praised as companions in winter. They are strong enough to clear their way through snowdrifts. Without them, some families would go hungry in isolation. Here is a strange little note. In some areas, villagers feed horses with hot grains cooked into porridge to keep them vigorous and strong during the coldest months. Imagine carefully stirring a pot of hot rice, not for your children, but for the animals that plough the fields and save their backs. Then there is the dog. Thin and sharp, they pace along the edge of the village, their bark carrying the frozen darkness. They guard against thieves, drive away wolves wandering around, and prevent rats from approaching the granary. Some just slept by the stove, curled up into a ball, and their fur provided an additional layer of insulation for the night. For children, the dog's warm body becomes a pillow. For parents, barking is an alarm, indicating that danger has not yet crept in quietly. The cat also played its role, half wild and half domesticated. They wandered in the corners of the farmhouses, pouncing on mice fattened by stolen grains. The villagers tolerated their indifference because every time they caught a mouse, they could save a mouthful of food. In folk tales, cats are described as mysterious protectors, with their glowing eyes capable of warding off evil spirits. In fact, their true magic lies in hunger and their ability to survive better than you. But how much do farmers rely on livestock compared to the food they store? Researchers still have differences. Some people believe that livestock is the true insurance for the poor, and that milk and manure are as important as bread. Others, however, stress that feeding animals in winter is often impossible, which leads to large minor-scale massacres every autumn. The truth is likely to lie somewhere in between. Families cling tightly to what they can hold on to and sacrifice what they cannot. Do you still remember that pig tied outside? He is noisy, gluttonous, and stinks, but he is also your treasure. If he could no longer bear the hunger, he would be slaughtered, his fat would be made into lard, his blood would be stirred into pudding, and his skin would be dried to make leather. Nothing will be wasted. Now, although he is still humming in the straw, his warmth and future have met another candle flickering in despair. In some villages, the oxen are brought home on the coldest nights. Their heavy breathing shrouds the rafters in a layer of mist, and their huge bodies emit heat like living stoves. The children leaned against their flanks, comforted by the slow rhythm of chewing. This is not glamorous, but it's about survival. There is another strange thing. In folk tales, people whisper that sleeping beside certain animals, such as sheep or goats, can drive away ills and fevers. Superstition and practicality are mixed together. In fact, their enthusiasm is more important than any charm. At night, you lie in bed listening to the symphony of the animals around you. The cow is looking around softly. The dog is riding around in its sleep, and the chicken is cackling faintly on the beam. Their voices mingled with your family's coughs and snores, eventually turning into a common lullaby. There was a smell of manure, smoke and wool in the hut. For modern people's noses, this might be unbearable, but for you, it's the scent of survival. Every beast has its role. Every sound convinced people that even though the snow outside was deep, there was still life buzzing in the village. Because in the winter of the Middle Ages, humans and animals were not separate worlds. They are equally desperate trading partners, sharing heat, sharing space, and sharing the long road to spring. The small house was filled with the footsteps of animals and the chattering of children. Another enemy is lurking quietly in the corner of winter: illness. Cold can sting the skin, hunger weakens the body, and diseases can easily slip into the gaps. As they had no doctor at hand, the villagers had no choice but to turn to the therapy passed down in their memory. Half practical and half mysterious, both carry a glimmer of hope. You watch an old woman collecting garlic. Even in a room filled with smoke, their pungent smell is very pungent. She crushed them with the tip of a knife and stuffed them into a bag tied around the child's neck. "It can bring down the fever," she murmured, "that no one can tell for sure whether it was a sulfur, but or just pure superstition." The records of medieval herbs confirm the reputation of garlic as a winter medicine. Its spines are believed to drive away diseases, as well as ghosts. Here is a strange little note. Heated stones are sometimes wrapped in tough and pasted on the chest or abdomen to drive away diseases. The warmth brought a sigh of relief, but the villagers believed that the stones actually drove away the diseases. Imagine that you're asleep and a hot stone is pressed against your ribs, believing that it can pull your fever out of your body. Other therapies can fill the air with strange odors. Bunches of rosemary or juniper were burning over the fireplace. Smoke billowed in the hut until everyone began to cough. They insist that it can purify the air, although your eyes are as many as your illness. If you still have honey, it can also be used as a medicine, mixed with herbs for coughing, applied to wounds, and swallowed to relieve the roaring sound in the throat caused by smoke and frost. But how effective are these folk remedies? Scholars still have differences. Some people believe that many herbal remedies offer real benefits. Garlic contains antibacterial oil and honey has a soothing effect. Others, however, warned that this was merely a ritual, a form of comfort, not a cure. The boundary between medicine and magic is constantly blurring, as thin as the smoke above a fireplace. You sat by the stove, trembling all over, wrapped in a patched cloak. A neighbor whispered a spell, drew a cross on your forehead and stuffed tabs into the rafters at the same time. Her words were half prayer and half incantation, but you couldn't interrupt them. In winter, every attempt at healing is worthwhile. The children had runny noses, red noses and coughs that echoed through the night sky. You boil the nettle into bitter tea and hold the cup with your little hand. Its smell made them frown, but its warmth soothed their stomachs. You apply an ointment made of animal fat and herbs to the cracked skin. The smell is pungent and greasy, but it's still very comfortable. When the priest visited, he brought holy water and sprinkled it on the bed and the fireplace. Water droplets hissed on the scalding stone, and the air was filled with a faint smell. The villagers knelt on the ground, hoping that this ceremony would drive the disease out of their homes. In fact, whether it is effective or not is not important. The act itself gives people courage. Under the candlelight, you will recall the stories told by the elders, the incantations made with wolf claws, the low prayers upside down to deceive those with a fever, and the herbs collected only at the full moon. You smile slightly, not because you believe in all this, but because belief itself is another form of healing. The night continued, and from time to time, coughs, prayers and the clinking of reheated stones could be heard. You listened to the mixed sounds of humans and animals, fever and fire, and realized that survival is not just about food and firewood, but about the belief in these little rituals. Because in the harsh winters of the Middle Ages, medicine was not merely about herbs or amulets. It is about giving people hope when the cold seems endless and the body is too fragile to fight alone. It is hoped that it will become the most powerful treatment method in its peculiar way. The air is still filled with the smell of garlic and herbs. But after the coughing subsided and the stones cooled down, another rhythm took over the hut. The story. Winter nights stretch on and on. Without them, you would be submerged in silence. So the fireplace turned into a stage. The shadows cast by the flickering flames bring life to the words. Imagine yourself sitting by the fire, with your legs tucked between your cloaks and a child leaning on your shoulder. The wood crackled and hissed, and sparks flew out of the chimney hole. In that dim light, someone cleared their throat and began to say, "A long time ago." The room tilted inward immediately. In the Middle Ages, villagers had no books to pass around, but they had voices. The story passes from one person's mouth to another's, and each time it is told, it changes. Some are sacred legends of saints bravely facing blizzards, or miracles of bringing food to hungry monks. Some are folk tales, telling of talking foxes, witches crawling in the snow, or heroes fighting giants in icebergs. Every story offers both comfort and lessons, weaving imagination into the misty air. Chroniclers point out that oral storytelling is as important as food in maintaining morale. When the land is barren, language becomes the seed planted in the heart. Apart from hunger, they gave people something to rely on. There is a strange prosperity here. Hissing riddles is the most popular pastime. The children giggled, while the adults laid out some ingenious puzzles, which were usually based on farm life. What can run without legs? Water. What has a mouth but never speaks? In a jar. These riddles carried laughter into long hours, until sleep finally arrived. The story itself often changes with the weight of winter. Some are stern warnings, such as cautionary tales of travelers freezing to death for straying from their paths, or stories of greedy lords being punished by ghosts for hoarding food. Some others are very humorous, making fun of clumsy animals or stupid neighbors. Laughter has become a shield, just like fire, a tool for survival. But how many of these stories are purely for entertainment, and how many are for education? Scholars remain unsure. Some people believe that stories are tools for moral education, strengthening obedience to God and the Lord. Others, however, regard them as outlets for humor and resistance, safely telling cunning jokes against authority in the firelight. Perhaps they are all lessons wrapped in laughter. Hope is hidden in fear. He moved closer to the fire, listening to the sound becoming softer and your tale drifting towards its end. The children drooped their eyelids, their heads resting on their shoulders and drooping. An elder threw another piece of wood onto it, and sparks shot up as if the story itself had already climbed into the flames. At that moment, hunger vanished, the cold receded, and the little house was filled with warmth, not woven from wood or wool, but from words. In the subsequent silence, you realize how many stories have held this village together. They remind you that before you have experienced the same cruel winter, saints, heroes, and even wise foxes have all overcome frost. They promise in their own quiet way that you can do it too. So when you finally lie back on the straw, these words linger in your mind like embers. It's snowing heavily outside. The wind is roaring. In this story, a fragile flame never goes out. Because in the winter of the Middle Ages, survival was not merely about eating or wearing. This is also what you tell yourself.